Teaching with Bloom's Taxonomy. Benjamin Bloom's interest in student learning was central to his life's work. He was in love with the process of finding out. As an American educational psychologist, he made contributions to the classification of educational objectives and to the theory of mastery learning. Benjamin Bloom was a teacher in the Department of Education at the University of Chicago, where he ran a course that was entitled Education as a Field of Study. The aim of that course was to try to understand the kinds of questions that might be asked about the field of education, and to explore the various ways in which those questions might be answered. So when we think about finding out about something, we ask questions. And depending on what type of questions we ask as to how much we find out. So in the 1950s, Bloom developed his 6 levels of critical thinking theory, which became known as Bloom's Taxonomy. Taxonomy of cognitive objectives or thinking objectives are used to classify educational learning objectives into levels of complexity. Bloom identified 6 levels within the cognitive or thinking domain, from the simple recall or recognition of facts as the lowest level, through increasingly more complex and abstract mental levels to the highest order, which is classified as creative thinking. What he did was provide a way to organise thinking skills into these 6 levels, from the most basic to higher order levels of thinking. It was a means of expressing qualitatively different kinds of thinking. It was adapted for the classroom to use as a planning tool for teachers and educators, and it continues to be one of the most universally applied models or frameworks of learning. Let's have a look at Bloom's Taxonomy for thinking. Taxonomy means classification of learning outcomes or objectives, where learning at the higher levels is dependent on having obtained prerequisite knowledge and skills at lower levels, like most learning. Take maths, for instance. Starting at lower level maths, computations such as addition and subtraction, for the basis of maths knowledge, are required in order to comprehend or complete multiplication and division computations. From here, maths can take on more complex problems, computations such as fractions and algebra. The categories can be thought of as degrees of difficulties. Start with the simple and become more complex. That is, the first one must be mastered before the next one can take place. This actually fits with Piaget's cognitive levels of thinking, concrete learning to abstract, and where Vygotsky's zone of proximal development talks about scaffolding learning by using what is known, addition, for example, what can be done with assistance from an adult, subtraction, to what is unknown and as yet can't be done by the learner, multiplication. Back to answering questions, or should I say asking questions. Depending on the type of question you ask will elicit less or more complex levels of thinking. If I ask you, do you drink coffee? You would invariably reply either yes or no. If I asked you what day it is, you might pause for a moment and reply Monday or Thursday. The pause allows you to recall information or facts you remember and requires only lower level thinking. However, if I asked you to talk me through the process of making a latte or a cappuccino, that question could require you to implement a higher order of thinking, or in fact you may have to research to find the answer. Higher level questions require complex application, analysis, evaluation, or creative skills. Higher level questions encourage students to think more deeply and critically, facilitate problem solving, encourage discussions, and stimulate students to seek more information. So let's look at each of these levels of thinking. The first level is about remembering. And the kinds of lead-ins that help us to remember are questions like, what happened after Goldilocks found the porridge on the table? How many bears were there in the story about Goldilocks? What is porridge? Who was it that went to sleep in the bed? Name all the characters in the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Find the definition of break and entering, because didn't she? Describe what happened after Goldilocks fell asleep. Who spoke to Goldilocks first? Which is true or false? These are all remembering kinds of questions. When we move to understanding, we go up a notch. Explain why Goldilocks went into the house. Write in your own words what happened. How would you explain to the three bears if you were found inside their house? Write a brief outline of what could have happened after Goldilocks woke up and ran home. What do you think could have happened next if, for instance, the three bears had been at home? What do you think about Goldilocks going into the house? What was the main idea of the story? Can you clarify what happened when she arrived in the house? Can you illustrate step by step what happened when she went into the house? Under applying, we now use what we remember and what we understand about the story and we apply it. Explain another instance where somebody went into somebody's house without being asked. Group by characteristics such as animals, people, things indoors, things outdoors. Which factors would you change if it was the three bears that went to Goldilocks' house? What questions would you ask of Goldilocks after the event? From the information given, develop a set of instructions about how you should make porridge. Analysing. Explain what must have happened when. Which events could not have happened in the story? What are some or the problems of? Distinguish between. What were some of the motives behind? What was the turning point? If it happened, what might the ending have been? How is situation similar to something that you know? What do you see as other possible outcomes? So in the analysing stage, we're really looking at alternatives to what we already know. Evaluating. So now we're making judgments. Judge the value of what do you think about Goldilocks having gone into the house. Defend your position about somebody being allowed to enter a house without being asked. Do you think that Goldilocks going into the house is a good or a bad thing? How would you have handled the situation? What changes to the story would you recommend? Do you believe the story? How would you feel if that happened to you? How effective are? What are the consequences? What influence will the story have on our lives? What are the pros and cons of what Goldilocks did? At the higher level, we go to that creative thinking. Design your own story or your own house. Devise a possible solution to the whole story. If you had access to all resources, how would you deal with Goldilocks' situation? Devise your own way to do something. What would happen if? How many ways can you create new and unusual uses for something? Develop a proposal which would provide. From here, we're going to move into the classroom. So what would be happening in the classroom if we were using blooms? What type of learning tasks might we expect to be doing? So at the remembering level, we might be naming things, spelling things, matching things, selecting things, defining things. Understanding, explain, predict, paraphrase, discuss. At application level, questions would be about using, making, demonstrating, drawing, and practicing. Using Bloom's taxonomy enables you to organise questions from simple knowledge questions to higher level thinking questions. The table illustrates how the selection of verbs used to ask questions reflects the level of thinking. You can use these verbs to ask students questions, increasing the complexity in any curriculum area. So this is the lower level thinking, remember, understanding and application, and higher order thinking involved with analysis, evaluation and creativity. So at an analysis level, we are developing, we're analysing, we're brainstorming and verifying. At the evaluation level, we were judging, assessing, prioritising and recommending. At the creativity level, we are improving, revising, we're making and we are creating. Asking questions is an important way of helping students to learn. This is sometimes referred to as a problem-solving approach. So in summary, Bloom's offers a systematic process of learning and thinking. It assists assessment efforts with easy-to-use format. It provides visual representation of alignment between goals and objectives with standards, activities and outcomes. It helps form challenging questions to help students gain knowledge and critical thinking skills. And it assists in the development goals, objectives and lesson plans. So this is an overview of Bloom's taxonomy. Your next step would be to read an article, watch a video or two, have a discussion with a colleague or peer, observe, listen to a teacher in the classroom to gain a greater understanding of how to utilise Bloom's framework of learning. As a teacher aide, the primary takeaway would be in starting to take notice of the questions you ask and how they are answered by your students. Are you getting them to recall or think? Do you want them to find out or research further in order to provide a better answer? If learning is to occur, it's imperative we get students to answer their own questions. Thank you very much for listening.